All right. So the world is ending officially because the national debt has gone up again. Nima, were you aware that it's actually going to end for real this time now that the national debt went up? Okay.
Yeah, I hear it every week. So yeah.
Yeah. Let's have Jimmy Dore give us some feedback on this. Here we go.
Okay, so here's another story I wanted to talk to you about. Well, you wrote about this in your Substack. The U.S. national debt is rising by $1 trillion about every 100 days. That's from CNBC.
Yeah.
The U.S. national debt is rising by $1 trillion. So that means, well, here. So here's your Substack. We wrote a little bit about it. It says this is just some of it. The national debt, which surpassed $34 trillion several years ahead of pre-pandemic projections, signals a dire mismanagement of our economic policies. The Congressional Budget Office in January 2020 did not expect this threshold to be reached until 2029.
Okay, Nima, there's really scary numbers here. Does anybody ever explain why these numbers are bad once they hit a certain point? So
no, I mean, it's like a large number of the word debt, and they both sound really scary. So that's about the extent of it.
Yeah.
We're there already. Mm-hmm. This acceleration is not just a number. It's indicative of a deeper systemic problem that threatens the very fabric of our economy.
I hope he tells us what the problem is, because they never seem to do that.
The national debt might not seem like a burden on the U.S. economy at the moment, given the continued willingness of investors to lend money to the federal government.
Yeah.
I'll let him finish this thing, and then we'll respond. This clip, then we'll respond.
Now, let me ask you about that. Now,
he's going to go. What? He's asking a
they
question.
say that the United States, it's a fiat currency, they just print it. But then I see things like where you said people have to lend it to them. So which is it? Does the government print the money, or do they have to borrow the money?
Jimmy's onto it. He's figured it out. He just doesn't know how to express it the right way.
Right. He doesn't have a consistent theory explaining the conundrum to him. And the way it works is, we know it's the government prints the money. It gets injected into circulation, and then they tax some of it out of circulation, and whatever remains in the private sector is the deficit, and it's also the private sector's net private savings, assuming balanced trade. Now we can get to unbalanced trade after that. Same idea though at the end of the day. But so basically, this 1 trillion, what do you say, a day or a year or a month or whatever?
1 trillion every 100 days.
1 trillion every 100 days. So the national debt is rising by $1 trillion every 100 days. No, actually, the national savings is rising by 100 trillion every day. So national private sector's net savings that is claimed against the government is rising by 1 trillion every 100 days. How does that sound? Does it sound so bad? Not really. I mean, and so to get back to the circle, to explain how the circle works, let's start from a hypothetical point zero. The government spends money into existence and taxes some of it out of existence. Some of that money remains in circulation for the private sector. Now the government chooses to offer treasury bonds that pay interest to those people that hold that excess money that's remained in the private sector.
And that's sorry to interrupt you, but that's what gets confused as, in quotes, investors lending money to the government.
Right. It's got, it really has nothing to do with what we experience in the private sector when we borrow money, or business raising money via, whatever method, stocks, bonds, commercial debt, bank debt. It has nothing to do with that. It's a very different. We're using the same language for fundamentally different concepts, because the issuer of the currency, different rules apply to the issuer of the currency. The issuer of the currency creates the money out of nothing and offers interest-paying bonds after the fact to cash holders in the private sector, and they wouldn't have to do that. There's no economic necessity to do that. The only people who want that to happen is the people who hold a lot of cash and who want to invest it in a risk-free, interest-paying option, such as people like myself, for example. So I'm not talking some theory or whatever. Treasury bonds are in every large investor's portfolio. A lot of large institutions hold treasury bonds. These all constitute the savings of the private sector, minus the bonds held by the Fed, and I guess you could also say minus the bonds held by foreigners. But then those are still private sector, in some other country. The point just being that it's really the national savings rising by 1 trillion every 100 days, not the national debt, even though that terminology.
Even though they use the word debt.
Yeah.
Right.
And also, I don't like probably 99% of the shit that the government spends money on. Okay. But to let all of that happen, all the budgets passed to spend on this, spend on that, LGBTQ this, bomb that country, send arms to that country, investigate Trump for shaking hands with a Russian 40 years ago. Trump touched me, whatever. I mean, all kinds of nonsense that money is being spent on. I'm not for that, but the venue to address those spending programs is when those particular bills get passed, not way after the fact, yelling at a number. Look at the large number. The number is very bad. Look, let's shake our fist at the number. That is pointless, counterproductive, and also what's mixed in is some economic illiteracy and inaccuracies about what all this actually means. Now, because, like I said, this money ends up in the private sector. That's good for the recipients of that money and for the businesses who receive money from those recipients, etc. But what is being done with the money is, of course, very bad, and we don't want those things. But those are two separate topics. How much the national savings is rising or falling is a separate topic from what does the government actually spend money on?
Right. And then I'm curious what whoever he's talking to is going to say in response, because Jimmy offers this confusion of like, okay, wait, the government prints it, but this thing's talking about investors. Well, I want to address it really quick, which Nima just brought up, is that unfortunately we use the same words for two completely different categories of money, which is the currency user, like me and Nima, or you watching this, or a company, or even the state government, a currency user that has to say, okay, where do we get this money in order to spend it, versus the currency issuer, which is the federal government going, well, we create the money. And when, like Nima was talking about, he's got bonds, I've got bonds too in my portfolio. And when we do that, if we, I got $100, I'm going to go run over and buy a bond and get $100 worth of bonds. We're not investing in the government. Right? That's not funding the government for anything. The government, because it has a sole issuing power, it's more accurate to think of it as that a bond is just as much money as a reserve. It's just that one pays an interest rate and one doesn't. Right? One's in a savings account, one's in a checking account. Account.
Yes, and this is we talked about the money supply on a recent show. Really, if we want to look at what's the country's total money supply, it makes a lot more sense to look at all, checking, savings, and the treasury bills and the treasury bonds. Exactly. Those are all sitting in private sector accounts, minus whatever's held at the Fed, which I'm not saying that that's good that the Fed is doing that. It's kind of, they're withdrawing those from availability by the private sector, right? That's interest money that could be going to the private sector that just ends up with the government itself in some accounting trickery that makes really no sense at the end of the day. On the other hand, of course, we've argued before, technically there's not even any necessity to even have treasury bonds.
Right.
The federal government could just say, we're done with this whole bonds thing. We're switching to reserves only. we're paying zero interest, and that's the end of the story. That would be the natural interest rate, if the Federal Reserve wasn't meddling on the interbank lending market and wasn't paying reserves to banks, in other words, wasn't using public money to meddle in the private sector, the the risk-free interest rate would naturally drop to zero or close to it, because there would be nothing but excess reserves in the banking system, and the banks want to get rid of reserves as quickly as they can because they want to hold more profitable loans, and they want to squeeze some interest out of the reserves. So they give it to banks who need them for whatever reasons, clearing here, clearing there. There would be an abundance of reserves in the system if the Fed wasn't meddling and raising the risk-free rate from zero to some higher level. And even intuitively, it makes sense. Why should you be rewarded for zero risk, right? Now, like I said, as an investor, I like it. Thank you very much. But
yeah, I'll take your money.
Yeah, I'll take your money. Thank you. Objectively, morally, there's no excuse for paying interest to people who already have money.
Right. So, I'll quick play here in a second. I want to hear what this guy says. But to answer you, Jimmy, you are right, and that what you're reading is just confusing claptrap because you've got the right answer that the government just prints it.
There's different versions of how money is created. One long time ago, Bill Clinton was president. He wanted to help folks that weren't perfect credit scores own a home. So he went to the
metals guy.
fractional lending. So banks can lend 10 times the amount of money they're sitting on, as best I understand it. So if a bank...
Yeah. That's the the fractional reserve lending theory, which
is false.
It's incredibly popular, yeah. And it goes a little something like this. You deposit your money at a bank, and now let's say you deposit $1,000 at the bank. Now the bank has $1,000 sitting there, but you're not going to withdraw those $1,000 immediately, so they can loan out 10 times that money to borrowers. They create new money, and in sort of a Ponzi scheme style, the new recipients of the money are also not going to withdraw the money all at once. So you're sort of banking on the fact that you're hoping that people just keep their balances with the bank, and you're lending out 10 times more than somebody put in the bank account in the form of reserves. And it's just a giant house of cards that keeps on leveraging. It's all going to collapse one day, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
That's not how the banking system actually works. Like, if I put $100 in the bank to start with this theory, where did that $100 come from, by the way? Like, that also, ultimately, it was always created by some bank loan or by some deficit spending government. Mm-hmm. The fractional reserve theory looks at reserves versus money actually in checking accounts. And then in hindsight fashion assumes, okay, that means that whatever money is sitting in checking accounts now, vis-a-vis reserve, the banks must have multiplied that. But do they ever talk to a banker to see if that actually ever is a thing that happens? In the loan agent doesn't have, like, here's the reserves we have available, so you can only lend out 10 times this much. Keep that in mind. No. When the bank finds a willing and able borrower, they're happy to loan and to create the money out of nothing to make a good quality loan. And then they will find the if based on that amount of checking, based on that amount of money lent, they need to hold some reserves. They will find the reserves after the fact. Every 2 weeks, so they will find them on interbank lending market. They will attract savings accounts. They may even, in the worst case, go to the Fed to borrow the reserves, which is frowned upon. The Fed's actually just read an article they're working on making that less of a stigma. And by the way, this is also what Hyman Minsky always said. This is how it should actually work. There should be no interbank market where the bank just meddles, where the Federal Reserve just meddles and manipulates the rate. Why don't they just all outright go to the Fed when they need reserves? And then this way...
Or why not just not need reserves? Why have a reserve rate at all? There's some countries that have 0% reserve rates, like Canada.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the there's that aspect where they have to hold like 10% in reserves or so according to regulations, but there's also reserves are needed whenever the checks are written to other banks when tax
Or tax
payments are
payments.
made,
I forgot about
and when people do cash withdrawals. So that's more important, and that happens sometimes. Sometimes a bank is short reserves and they need to facilitate interbank check clearing. Then they will borrow the reserves they need on the interbank lending market, or they attract more savings accounts, and then they have the reserves they need. And recently it was a relevant situation. We have a whole show about this. Actually, I can show it here if people want to watch that. I think it's probably going to be helpful to
Nima, my screen's screwing up, and I won't be able to switch the screen share to you unless I close it and open it again.
Okay, I'll send it to you.
Yeah.
That's an episode. It's our episode 93. We delve into a detailed discussion into how banking works and what happened during the lead up to the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank.
There it is. Can you see it?
Let's see. Where'd my thing go? Where's my AV Mux? Okay, here it is. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, this is it. We won't go over this in detail, like Nima said.
Yeah, so there was an interesting conundrum that SVB, the Silicon Valley Bank, found itself in because so there was a compendium of factors, if you will. Treasury, they bought a lot of treasury bonds, I think, in 2021 or so. And the reason for that was that there was just an unprecedented amount of reserves that had been pumped into the entire private sector because of very high deficits due to the lockdown era and that whole fiasco. I mean, it was a bonanza for private businesses, and tons of money and checks were sent to individuals because they weren't allowed to work anymore. All that kind of stuff made the bank's reserve balances rise quite significantly. And there was an article about this also. So at the time, there wasn't really much. There was zero interest on short-term bonds, on treasury bonds, bills, and so some banks they bought a lot of treasuries at like 1% or so, just to squeeze out a little more interest. They bought long-term treasuries on their reserves account, and we go through that in detail in that episode, like literally with balance sheets and numbers, etc. With an example. But so yeah, in 2022, then rates were raised so rapidly, so fast, that a lot of these bonds lost value, and the whole the investors' expectations of future rates changed significantly. And so bonds lost something like, I don't know, like 20-30% of value. So now, in the case of Silicon Valley Bank, there was a lot of FUD raised, fear, uncertainty, and doubt over their ability to honor balances and honor account holders. So people start withdrawing money. And very big name people, I think Peter Thiel and a bunch of VC funds, they just started raising warnings about SVB Bank.
And billions. They're withdrawing billions.
Withdrawing lots of money. Now, also what's happening at the same time was the Fed offering what's called the RRP, the reverse repo facility, which allowed money market funds to offer very high yielding investments to investors. So a lot of people would pull their money out of the bank account, out of their checking accounts, put it in a money market mutual fund, which you can also write checks against, but at a much higher rate. So to a bank, checking accounts are really like gold because they add to the reserves of the bank which they need to facilitate clearing, etc., and to meet some regulatory reserve balances. And
They don't pay anything for them.
They don't pay anything. They pay zero interest on those. So that's great for a bank. But those went away, and they had to be replaced with much higher paying savings, so by attracting savers, for example, or by going to the interbank lending market to borrow reserves. And now, because a lot of banks in the 2020s, etc., they had made very low interest loans. So for SVB, the problem was that the profitability calculation long term may not really make sense anymore. I mean, this was even worse, I think, with First Republic. With SVB, what added to that was then also the decisions were made very hastily, as far as we could tell. Like, oh, this bank's insolvent now, and
right, the commissioner of finance or whatever of California just declared.
They declared the bank insolvent, even though, as far as I know, there wasn't any event where somebody wasn't getting paid, really, and maybe for a day or so. But it wasn't like a big old default like the 2008.
Yeah, Silicon Valley looked like it was getting its act together.
Yeah, and so but then, oh no, we shut them down, hand it all over to this new agency, and I think J.P. Morgan took on a lot of it. Maybe First Republic, that was definitely a lot of it was snapped up by J.P. Morgan.
First Citizens took a lot of it too. In fact, I was talking to First Citizens about getting a loan for another reason, and the banker there mentioned that this is right after Silicon Valley. The banker mentioned that First Citizens was taking a lot of the assets from the Silicon Valley Bank shark feeding frenzy.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was great bonanza, I'm guessing. And then after that, the Fed started offering a new lending facility to banks where they could get reserves for their treasury bond holdings at face value.
Oh, God. So, which would have immediately fixed Silicon Valley Bank's problem.
Which it basically amounts to pushing a button and saying, oh, it's all okay again, right? So a lot of this stuff is really just very stupid.
It's really just pushing buttons and saying it's all okay or it's not all okay, right?
Right, we declare it okay now. So now a lot of banks have taken advantage of that. Actually, I'm just saying I read on some recent news stories that facility is running out now. I think that the banks will probably be fine because the RRP isn't as aggressive anymore. The bank accounts the banks aren't being drained of their reserves anymore like they were back then. Quite the opposite, actually. I think reserves are returning to the banks. Mm-hmm. We showed some charts of that in a few shows as well. And so, why did we start talking about this reserve stuff?
Because this guy was talking about the fractional reserve system.
Right.
Okay. He understands that we work on a fractional reserve system, right. And as we've gone over ad nauseum on the show, that doesn't actually exist. The reserves don't limit the bank's ability to lend.
It's not how the banking system works. It's more like, so I think the most concise explanation is they have it backwards, right? They look at, this is the amount of checking money, this is the reserves. So they must have multiplied the reserves because they lend out reserves, right? That's what banks do, except they don't. They can't lend out reserves. It doesn't even work that way. Reserves are only for banks. They never hit Main Street. They never hit the economy outside of the banking system. They're a back-end operation.
Accounting operation, right.
Exactly. So part of it is so the Fed can have some regulatory leverage over the banks. Part of it is just so the bank system can function, right? Imagine a bank that just declares, here's checking account money out of nowhere. Then the Fed has no control over that bank, right? Plus, the bank would go bankrupt immediately because once somebody writes a check to another bank, then that other bank would say, hey, we need reserves in the amount of so and so much, and they couldn't send the reserves because they have none, right? So it's part of what you need to, if you want to operate in the national banking system, it's part of what you need to do.
People in government, all the elected officials, owed us this $34 trillion. What if we said, pay us or go, right? So if you quit paying your mortgage, what does the bank say? Pay us or go. right? So there's no. This is where the checks and balances ends. There is no checks and balances on this being debt. Debt is repaid. 34 trillion is never getting repaid, folks.
So not only is 34 trillion getting repaid, it gets repaid all the time.
It's repaid regularly, actually. In fact, way more than 34 trillion roll over every year. I don't have the numbers on me right now, but I think per year the federal government repays something like 100 trillion or so. In treasury bonds and bills. So it's constantly repaid all the time. It's just when people talk about 34 trillion, they're talking about the current balance of securities outstanding. That's
and
it.
then it's important to reiterate this isn't debt in the same way that this guy's talking about like a mortgage. This is, I have a security called a bond that's going to have an interest rate and it's going to mature by a certain date. And when that happens, there's somebody at the Federal Reserve that presses a button and a number moves from this balance sheet to that balance sheet. And that's it.
At this point, is probably not even any button pressing needed anymore.
That's exactly what I was going to say next. Computer just takes care of all of it. Yeah.
Automatic autopilot thing. But yeah, this is a common thing that people say, ooh, what happens when China calls in the loans, right? There's no such thing, calling in the loans. There's no loans, first of all. These are securities that come with terms and with stipulations. And when they mature, the federal government swaps them out for cash, and that's it. There's no loan. There's no
ability of the bondholder to say, I'm calling the loan due.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. No ability nor the desire on the part of the bondholder to say that. You bought the bond with specific terms, and that's what you get.
Yeah.
Right.
And $1 trillion every 100 days is more of a sign. And, we can be angry about how it's all gone, but now it's so dire. We need to start looking at how do we defend ourselves.
Now it's, this guy's going to sell us gold, Nima.
So I was going to say, so this has been the perma answer from gold bugs for as long as I can recall.
The perma problem and the perma answer, right?
Right. Since 2008, and longer, of course, but I'm just bringing up 2008 so you can sort of visualize how that has gone. How's it gone for the gold bugs compared to people who are open to diversify more, right? And I'm not saying all gold bugs are purely gold, but we have done shows on here talking about a strategy that I like, that I do apply, which is the permanent portfolio. It's a portfolio designed by Harry Brown, consists of 4 different asset classes: cash, bonds, gold, and stocks. And that's a very low volatility, long-term portfolio that grows over time. And if the stock market does great, you do well. And if the others do good, then you do well. Every asset class of the portfolio lifts the portfolio up, and they all help each other in a way. So yeah, but then you're not going to do the permanent portfolio unless you understand all the stuff that we talk about here, unless you understand that these treasuries are not really debt, and stocks can also do great, as some may have noticed on occasion. So it's good to diversify. And I'm not against gold, right? I'm one of the biggest fans of gold, probably. I hold a lot of gold in my portfolio, but I don't just do it for the sake of holding gold.
Because it's going to end any second, and gold is going to be the only thing valuable after fiat is figured out is actually worthless by everybody.
Right. Once we run out of food, I'm going to eat my gold. So yeah, it's a part of a bigger picture strategy, and it's a little more complicated, right, than just accumulating your gold back.
Yeah, and then again, we at the beginning of this, we pointed this out, that this 34 trillion, whatever the number is, he goes, it's unsustainable now. Why now?
Always.
What is special about the mathematics of 34 trillion that wasn't special about 20 trillion? Like,
Right.
what's
It's always this is always the moment where it's unsustainable. Is whenever the pundit is talking on TV. That's always
and is about to sell us
coincidentally.
gold? Let's see if he's going to sell us gold right now, Nima.
Against what might be coming, and history seems to show examples of this reserve currency rising and falling into failure. The $1 trillion every 100 days is a sign that things are progressing much worse than any of the brightest minds in Washington or Wall Street were able to project. The needs growing faster than their understanding of how bad the needs are.
And them basically inventing $1 trillion every 100 days. How does that not lead to inflation? That has to, right?
Of course, the whole thing's been in.
Jimmy hit the nail on the head again. Why is it? I mean, he doesn't say hyperinflation, but we're saying these huge, incredibly unrealistic numbers, and we're not seeing the world come to an end. Why not?
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, there is a point there that we've always said this on our show. Large deficits contribute to aggravated inflation levels. What we're not saying is it's going to turn into runaway hyperinflation that's uncontrollable, right? So we have predicted on our show when the COVID deficits came, we said there's probably going to be elevated inflation at higher levels, somewhere between 5 and 10% for several years to come. And that's sort of materialized. And I think now it's been slowing down over the past year or two.
And then it happened exactly the point that all the global supply chains got messed up. I'm still wondering if the global supply chains and the war, I mean, the Ukraine war, for example,
absolutely,
is just totally screwing stuff up. I mean, this is the Peter Zahan level thing that we've been talking about from other shows. Like, look at the Strait of Hormuz and is the Strait of Hormuz the same one as the Suez Canal?
No, because the Strait of Hormuz is Iran.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So the Suez Canal, the Strait of Hormuz. So in the Suez Canal, going through the Red Sea, we've already had the Houthis, what are they called? Attacking and commandeering ships, right? And there's companies going, well, shit, we're not going through the Suez Canal anymore because it's dangerous.
Yeah.
Well, what does that do to the pricing of everything?
Right. So that's part of global supply chain systematically breaking down, and the end of globalism as we know it, as we've discussed on some of our other shows. Right. That is happening. That's contributing to the inflation. Certainly, the stupidity of the COVID supply chain meddling obviously has made things more expensive. But that, the stupidity gets injected. It causes all kinds of stuff. The prices rise. And as the prices rise, we see we look at the rate of acceleration of prices, the inflation rate, right? But at one point it reaches a level where it levels out. And that's kind of where we're at now, I think.
Well, and I think it's also important to point out, we've pointed this out on the show before, when it comes to creating new money and how that causes inflation. Yes, there's a connection there. However, as long as there's still stuff to buy, if there's still capacity to fill out, you're not really going to see it. In the same sense that, okay, there's a grocery store and there's 100 items on the shelf. Let's say it just sells one thing for the sake of the simple argument, and the community only has enough money to buy half the items off the shelf. If you keep introducing money into the community and they can continue buying what's left on the shelf, the prices aren't going to go up until everything's gone off the shelf. If you start introducing more money, now you're having more money competing for the same amount of resources, right? So unemployment is indicative of a resource that's not being fully utilized, which is literally labor. And the fact that you still have unemployment, I understand it's more complicated than this, but the fact that you still have unemployment is kind of the base level indicator.
I'm trying to share a chart while you talk.
What's that? Oh,
I'm trying to share a chart to illustrate.
Let me maximize that chart. There we go. Yeah. So if if there's still unemployment, not enough money has been spent into the system to purchase everybody's labor. Right? So as long as there's still unemployment, again, I'm totally oversimplifying this and kind of acting like the money just kind of falls into an ocean. I mean, there's spikes and weird stuff all over the, welfare and stuff that makes this complicated. But in general, as long as there's unemployment, you could still spend into the system without really recognizing any inflation due to spending.
Yeah,
right?
so
There's other reasons that can cause inflation, but due to creating money, you shouldn't see any inflation, that much inflation. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're seeing here that U.S. industry capacity utilization has fallen below 80 again. So this downtrend here is a major headwind for any inflation trends, right? It keeps inflation subdued, and also, as we saw here, obviously when the lockdown started, it went as low as almost 60, below 65 actually. And so you can drop a bunch of money into the system, it's going to go into capacity utilization to some extent, and so that reduces the inflation shock. And on the other hand, however, in the case of COVID, so much capacity was destroyed or made inefficient that we did see, obviously we've been seeing some inflation over those years. And then also another aspect of this is, of course, how is the new money spent, right? Is it spent on building new bridges, facilities, roads, or infrastructure, or is it spent on Apple iPhones and cases and new gadgets?
Or PPP loans that go straight to owners to stick straight in their savings account so they can buy a yacht.
Yeah. So
right.
So in the case of the COVID money, a lot of it was just thrown around to facilitate consumer spending, and in fact, Tim Cook of Apple said as much. He said, "We're reporting record profits thanks in part to the government's support, the support money that was
the PPP loans and such
during the lockdowns." So, and then of course, war spending is very inflationary. You're injecting money to destroy things in the real world, and then also spending on military in general is very specialized. You have to hire very specialized, very rare engineering skilled people and stuff like that to build.
And you're putting money into the system and taking resources out of it.
Well, yeah, you're adding money, and you're not putting new consumable resources into the system. Anytime that kind of spending,
resources or capital, right?
Yeah,
you're just taking stuff out of the private sector that the private sector doesn't get to use at all.
So anytime that kind of spending happens, government deficit spending, export surpluses, and private investment spending. These are all types of spending that add more money to the system, but do not add new consumable resources into the system. In fact, in the case of export surpluses, they get removed from your country. In the case of investment, people build new things, gadgets, machinery, etc., but no new consumable products come out of this. So these types of spending combined together as a percentage of GDP tend to be the prime causes of inflation. Of course, there can be other stuff, political issues, wars, just a pure destruction of resources. That can always happen.
Inflation, the whole thing. It's like, we could talk about this other piece. I'll save it in the Substack. The reason, the Grand Canyon size hole, what created that in our finances. We can talk about that in a second. But yes,
there's one other thing I wanted to say about inflation. Raising interest rates causes inflation for two reasons. Everybody thinks raising interest rates lowers inflation because it makes money more expensive, so more money isn't getting created. First off, that there doesn't seem to be any evidence that that's the case. But more importantly, like we just said, it's just a risk-free security, these treasury bonds. So if you increase the interest rate, you're just increasing the amount of risk-free money that you're throwing at anybody who either A, holds a treasury bond, or B, has any money in a savings account. And maybe even more importantly, you're increasing the cost of credit. So like anything, any business, capital, anything that is utilizing the cost of credit in order to get business done, it just made that more expensive, and that end price has to be passed on to the consumer. So it's just this arbitrary dial. I learned that from Mike Norman. Just this arbitrary dial that raises prices for no reason.
Yeah, I think I found a pretty good explanation of this relationship in a recent article that I shared with you from Disciplined Funds.
Are you going to pull it up?
I have it here. Yeah, I think it may be interesting. Just look at that real quick.
Switch. There should be a button for you to switch the tab you're sharing. You still got the Fred. Oops.
Stop the screen share, and now I do share. Okay. How do higher interest rates push inflation?
Wait, hold on. Let me get it up here. There you go.
Yeah, and I'm not going to read, but people can read from that article. It's, I guess I'll share the link here somewhere. Can I share the link? Comments. Oh, we have a comment from Jesus.
Yeah, from Jesus.
From Jesus. Acts like helicopter money. Yes, that is true to some extent. I've recently sort of refined my understanding of this a little bit after I read this article and the stuff that's been going around in my head for a while. So when the Federal Reserve first raises interest rates, it's true that you don't need to. You can keep that article up so people know what we're talking about. Love Mike Norman. He gives away $1 million worth of knowledge. Yeah, he does. So, do interest rates push inflation down? I think they can, actually. He made a good argument in this article. When interest rates are first raised, a lot of asset prices come down. Bond prices come down.
Like housing pricing. Okay.
Stock prices come down. Housing prices may come down also. But more importantly, a lot of financial assets that people hold in their portfolios, like their liquid cash assets, fall in value. So that has an effect on how wealthy people feel, and that has an impact on how they spend, right? So I just want to, I'm listing all the different effects, everything that happens when the rates are raised. On the one hand, people receive more interest payments on the money in their savings account, on their short-term treasury bills. Yes, but a lot of long-term investments, bonds, stocks fall in value. So people feel, actually they don't feel, they are less wealthy to that extent that those asset prices come down. That may impel some people to cut down on spending during that specific period, right? But then also he makes the case, so the asset prices come down, and from here, it's all, the market has dialed itself into the new situation. Rates are higher, asset prices come down, but now the interest payments keep flowing in at this high rate. So there could be an initial shock, an initial disinflationary or deflationary shock from these asset prices coming down. But then the economy will basically start at a lower base with higher interest payments. And now there's actually room for inflation to start developing over the next couple of years if the rates stay elevated. And the asset devaluations have already happened, right? So now over the coming years, these higher interest payments will be more and more cause and more contribute towards inflation. Versus in the very beginning, the very first thing that happens when interest rates are raised sharply is that asset prices immediately come down. The interest payments haven't come in yet, but the asset prices have fallen right away. So that can have a disinflationary effect for a little while. Now, of course, it has to be balanced against the fact that a lot of people receive more interest on their savings, on their treasury bills, etc. And then, like you said, the cost of loans effect. The the income effect, of course, right? More interest means more income to some bank accounts, to some people. And higher income allows you to borrow more. So
I guess to your point, there's all sorts of factors. Some push
Right.
it up, some push it down. It's
Exactly.
complicated.
It's complicated, but you can make a case that the initial shock, it may be disinflationary, deflationary, but then over time, there's actually the stage is set for a longer term, higher levels of inflation because his interest payments keep rolling in. And on the net, then these interest payments, they are inflationary. But once the asset price shock has been absorbed and all that, the interest payments, because some people pay more on their loans, right? So that's the one side of things. But also, people receive more money in their savings accounts. So that whole thing is a wash. But the interest paid on treasury bonds and treasury securities is a net injection. There's no counterbalancing drain on those on that money in the economy. So that is a net injection that leads to more interest income in the economy.
Damn straight. Let's keep going.
The government's paying bills. They're not building ski resorts in Austria or condos on the moon.
Right.
So where are the bills coming from? That's the question.
Well, a lot of it's coming from the military-industrial complex. I know that.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So this lending facilitates ongoing government spending on various programs without the need to raise taxes.
Yeah.
So that's that whole thing of. So I had this woman on our show, Stephanie Kelton, and she wrote a book about.
He had Stephanie Kelton on, and then he's going to this guy.
Why now I'm blanking on the term that she uses about modern monetary policy theory. That's
MMT.
it. MMT. That's it. And she explained that when they pass a law to go pay for something, let's say, hey, we want to send $150 billion to Ukraine. They don't go raise taxes to pay for that. They just print it.
Yeah.
And they just send it.
Yeah.
And and she's saying, so I don't even know why they collect taxes anymore if taxes are completely uncoupled from what they're spending.
Jimmy gets it.
Yeah.
He just needs someone to tell him that he's right.
Right. So what we've said before, the only reason to raise taxes is to give some value to that money, to create demand for that money, not because the government needs it. It's just to give the money value.
Or in the extreme case, if there was too much money that was put out, that some of it needed to get pulled back because it was too inflationary from how much they created. That is also a possibility. Yeah,
taxes are a drain on that new net money, and
right, and
everyone, it's the most universally required thing in the economy. People have to pay their taxes. Not everyone, but a lot of institutions, a lot of businesses need to pay their taxes. So that's where the money flow ultimately flows back to the government that spent it into existence at first. And that's what gives the money value. So that's how we should look at taxes. Taxes are needed to give the money value, not to raise money to then go on and spend that money that was taxed.
Which, Jimmy...
this applies to the federal government.
Tell him that. Now he's got this other person on.
This applies to the federal government, to be clear. Now, state and local governments, they do need to raise taxes. They are users, not issuers of the currency.
So that's what this says. The lending facilitates government spending on programs without raising taxes to pay for it.
Yeah.
So, however, the reality is built on a precarious foundation. The dollars created out of thin air since 2008 have averted a depression, but at what cost? What is that cost?
Why are the dollars created since 2008 different from the dollars created before 2008?
Destruction of the currency.
You don't have to answer that. Just
So sometimes how I explain to my retirees, it's like you have financial oxygen on your back, like a tank of financial oxygen you sip off of, and it allows you to go wherever you want. You bring that with you, right? You go on a cruise ship, you go visit the kids, fishing in Alaska, pay your bills. And so what if that oxygen tank were to run out of air?
Mm-hmm.
What are you doing next? You're a greeter at Walmart? Not to be, just to say that most people don't want to be standing when they're older all day long,
right?
Or working at all, right? They did that work. They saved that money. Others seem to be willing to put that saved money at risk. So the ultimate threat is that the currency is destroyed And so therefore the values within that currency, it would make sense to me, would disappear with it. And the one calculation I can give to just help people visualize what that might be is that, if the dollar's worth 100 cents and a home's worth 20 grand, and today a home's worth 440 grand and the dollar's worth 3 cents, where was the change agent? We just destroyed the dollar, flooded the world with money. It ended up in real estate. And now that same $20,000 house is $440,000 today. Because we did.
So, I mean, I understand his point about you can't buy as much with the dollar as you could yesterday, particularly in the housing market. But that's not, A, that's not destroying the dollar. And B, that's not necessarily because more money was printed. Right? I mean, as confusing as you were, or not confusing, but as complicated as you were talking about with the interest rate, like, okay, here's interest rates could raise. Here's the myriad of factors that could cause prices to go up or cause prices to go down. Like, the value of real estate has a myriad of factors.
Real estate is obviously is a function of population and new home construction. And that is one big thing where, I mean, I don't know the rest of the world, but the US is lagging behind on home building. They need about 2 million homes per year to just be back to, I don't know, I think Mike Norman, he showed some numbers, but I think back in the 60s or 70s or whatever, there was like 2 million a year home construction, and the interest rates were actually pretty high also at the time.
Right.
So we've been below that number for a while. So we need to be above 2 million. It needs to be, and that could be other causes, right? There's all kinds of stupid policies that make it harder and harder to build new homes, build new.
And then don't forget, there's like I don't know how big of a factor this is, but like the Chinese system is on the verge of collapse. And it's been for decades that people with any money in China are like frantically trying to figure out some other place to put it to protect their money. And they'll come to another country and just throw it on real estate. And they won't argue about the price. Yeah. They just stick this money somewhere where our currency isn't going to get destroyed.
Yeah.
Right. And then, go ahead.
Well, there's a lot of factors. Okay. Now, more money in the system is also one factor, of course, I think. Right. I mean, there is constantly more money added to the system. So that's always the case. So we can jump up and down and complain about that until the cows come home. But that's just a fact of the capitalist economy. There's constantly has to be profitability. Businesses have to increase their profits over time. And the worker productivity over time rises, more profits are made. But in order for investment spending to continue, there needs to be continual profitability in the corporate sector and vice versa. In order for there to be continued profitability, there needs to be more investment spending. We ran through the Kalecki equation a while ago, and basically there has to be deficit spending, investment spending, and export surpluses don't have to be if the other two are present, and consumption out of capital also by the capitalists. These are all factors that add to aggregate profitability. And so, yeah, the system is generally set up to grow and to grow the money supply. That's a constant, basically. That doesn't help us make better decisions with our money, to complain about that. And also to reduce the money supply would not help either. It wouldn't solve fundamental problems. It would actually cause a recession, depression. You may get a fascist or a super communist government in power that nationalizes everything. The money supply by itself is not a very helpful figure to focus on.
It's not. And then, I mean, with the real estate here, we could sit here and think of 37 different things that contribute to the price of real estate. And like you said, yeah, okay, maybe money supply is part of that. But to just
Yeah.
point at the money supply and say that's the reason that the real
Right.
estate got more expensive it's just not accurate.
Right, because it's always the case. And then also, so there's and another factor is that people have the ability to protect themselves against inflation. People on the individual level have the ability to invest in short-term interest-paying instruments, long-term interest-paying instruments, stocks, etc. That's the reason why we promote doing these things, so that you are protected from the effects of inflation in the long term. Real estate also being part of those things. Yeah. So these are these prices increase over time. There's more money in the system over time. How do you deal with it? What do you do? Obviously, is the important question. And also,
Yes.
so by the way, interest paid on savings accounts. It sounds ridiculous to most people because they're used to such low interest rates, but now they're up to almost 5%, and inflation has now come down to below 5% already. So over time, even just the interest on savings account gives you some sort of compensation for inflationary loss. I'm not saying it's perfect, not saying it's always spot on. It maybe have been less over the past decades. Now it's actually higher than the inflation. So this always happens. I'm not saying rely on savings only, but just making the point that, yeah, as the prices of these assets go up, we have a new comment from Andrew. As the price of these assets go up, you have ways to grow alongside those price increases. It's not like you staying at the same level and all the other prices keep going up. Now, if you make bad decisions, then that's what's going to happen to you financially, yes, but it doesn't have to be this way. Hi,
Let's keep
Andrew.
going.
Andrew,
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. We appreciate your.
I love your content.
comment.
Always thanks for making. Well, thank you. That's why we do it.
Right.
There's not a billion people that live here now.
Right.
We only have 40% more people here than when we cut free of the gold standard.
So it's the exact same wood, brick, and mortar,
Yeah.
but now it's just worth. So that means you're saying that a big part of that is the devaluation of the dollar.
Yeah, destruction of it. Destruction of its buying power. There's two measurements on it. There's how strong is the currency against the euro or the yen or the pound. And then there's the buying power of a currency. The buying power, the dollar, again, has no value unless it's backed by something of value. Back it by.
It's backed by the value of the fact that it's demanded in taxes.
Yeah. So
Any other currency ever.
One thing to add here, right? So because they're they're talking about real estate. And it may be true that there's tons and tons of policies passed by Congress that are causing the price of real estate to go up because there's so much focus on encouraging home ownership and home lending. And then there was the Community Reinvestment Act that caused a lot of the 2008 excesses. So I think that there is maybe some legislative reasons as to why real estate is just going up so disproportionately when compared to other prices. Once again,
Think about what Richard Werner said about this.
Yeah.
It's this idea that, okay, should lending, which is money creation from the banking system, be focused on purchasing assets, or should it be focused on investing into businesses that produce goods and services and hire people? His point is that if you do the latter, it's not going to be inflationary because you're increasing the goods and services while you're increasing the money supply. But if you focus on the former, which could be houses, it could be boats, it could be cars, it could be stocks, it could be anything, is you're increasing the money supply to bid up the... I mean, I understand that the amount of houses are going up every year, but like you said, it's not enough. You're bidding up a limited number of assets. And so, like, when it comes to buying houses, this is just occurring to me as we were talking. It's not like, okay, everybody's got a certain amount of money in our pockets, and we got to go pay, who can pay the most for this house depending on how much money they have in their pockets. No, I mean, some people have that much money they can do that, but for most home buyers, you go to the bank, and it's A, whatever the bank's willing to lend you, and B, can you afford the payment?
Yep.
So, I mean, this is what happened in 2008, right? When the all these banks were doing these liar loans, like you could just say stated income and they gave you the loan, that increased the money creation to go toward bidding up assets. And it had nothing to do with economics. It had everything to do with regulation.
Yeah,
So
for sure. There's a lot
little
of
regulation tweaks have huge impacts on how these prices fly around and
there's
how the
just
money's created.
there's a lot of obsession over promoting homeownership, and I mean I have nothing against promoting homeownership, but then at the same time it may have now turned into a situation where it's become hard for a lot of people to be able to afford a home, to have the income to be able to get a loan to afford a home. One more thing I wanted to mention on this is that because it is really, the degree to which real estate and rent has gone up compared to income and other things is really kind of
unreal.
ridiculous, right? So
Yeah.
there has to be some issues in terms of supply and demand that are unresolved here, and part of it may be too much money is being just pushed into asset buying. For example, the same site that we just looked at earlier, Discipline Funds, he declared a winner, I guess, in the year 2023 or whatever. He said, who was the big inflation winner? Which investment asset was the biggest inflation winner since 2020? And it was not gold, by the way. He said it was buying real estate using a loan. That was the biggest inflation winner, because when you get a loan, you're betting that interest rates will go up after you bought the loan. And sorry, when you get a loan, not buy, when you receive a
Unless you
loan,
get an adjustable rate mortgage or adjustable rate
Yeah.
loan, in which case you're betting that they go down.
which is rare. But yeah, if you get a fixed rate loan, you're betting that the rates will go up from here. I mean, they may go down, and you can refi it, but generally you're betting the rates will go up, and you lock in a good rate. And when you buy a real estate object, you bet that you're betting on the price of that real estate object going up. So when you bought a house in 2020 on credit, and you got on a mortgage, you won in both these compartments, right? You locked in a low interest rate, and you bought an appreciating asset, and you're now sitting
Double win.
with an
Yeah.
asset, and you're paying very low. Like I bought my real estate in 2020. 2019 actually, and then I refied, I think, shortly thereafter. So I end up paying a rate of 2.87% on an asset that has appreciated 80% or so since then. So that's why a lot of people are sitting, a lot of real estate investors are sitting pretty good. So, have a very low interest mortgage, asset has appreciated massively. But for those who don't have those assets right now, it just looks ridiculous. Obviously, I can understand that.
Right. Either you got in the boat when the boat left, or you're stuck on shore and you're screwed, right?
Yeah, and we need more home building for that, I think. There needs to be much more home building. And that comes with, don't have stupid people do regulations in your city of how tall condo buildings are allowed to be built. Don't do a whole bunch of environmental regulations to cripple expansions. These are all factors that play into this. But I mean, you can get some good real estate out in the country still. You can get some good real estate somewhere in Idaho, and I think Montana is where everyone's going to. But you can look around. It's just like, there's the cities skew these stats quite a bit, I think.
Still learning how to do this right. There we go.
Oil. The petrodollar was an attempt to do
Right.
that.
Petrodollar.
And it allowed a lot more flexibility for the government to wield bigger financial armament against the world, control the world, grow the military, just, take over. The Monroe Doctrine on absolute steroids. But living within the gold standard, then you're living within your means, and you have to live right size, and you have to be honest about things. You have.
Okay. I can't. It just grates me the wrong way when we hear this. On the gold standard, you live within your means. No, you don't.
Yeah, no,
Right?
You are fleeced. The government, when he talks about you, it's all very fuzzy, right? So the government is forced to run a balanced budget, and that means that they have to tax you more whenever they need more money in order to be able to exist within the gold standard.
And the money supply can't expand when it needs to.
Right. So if there's willing and able borrowers who have great projects, great ideas, but the gold isn't there to support that, then loans can't be made. So it's an arbitrary. The gold standard, like I always say, the gold standard is a fiat money system with the
Fixed price of gold.
With the side goal of fixing the price of gold, basically, which with the side constraint that you're meddling with the gold markets, fixing the price of gold as a government. And that leads to generally austerity. And that means that the private sector will have less assets available to it and less net private sector savings to be able to expand, to be able to buy homes, to be able to do this and that, or invest in better new machinery, better operations, more efficiency.
So it arbitrarily limits the economy.
That's basically, the gold standard puts an arbitrary limit on things that could be done in the economy. And the gold standard isn't really this natural money system like people think. It was actually, if you read Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, for example, he writes about this. It was a tool by the banking system. The banking system, more than anyone, is absolutely paranoid about inflation because they rely on fixed income, and the value of that fixed income goes down as inflation rises. So they had an incentive to lobby for, promote, and institute a gold standard, basically, at all costs. It could be, people lose their homes, people lose their jobs, and the economy doesn't do well. Destroys businesses,
destroys agriculture. Who cares?
Doesn't matter to them as long as they can collect the interest, and then maybe seize assets if needed, and then now they sit on assets. Not saying that banks enjoy that kind of stuff, but they are definitely into protecting their bag at all costs, right? So if there's a gold standard, then that is something that banks have tended. The banking lobby has tended to prefer that kind of system. And Carol Quigley also writes, like a free-floating money, fiat money system tends to be more preferred by industry and agriculture. So there's always different lobbies promoting one or the other.
And then also this, because I'm sure he's going to be implying this, or already implied it as well, that, okay, well, maybe we can't do these things as an economy, but at least it slows down the government by stopping it from doing stuff like going to war. It never does, because when the government wants to go to war, they either just change or abolish the gold standard.
Right. And then, of course,
okay, the local economy can't have anything for the good side of it, and then it doesn't stop the bad side of it because they just change their minds.
Yeah, if we don't have a gold standard, then Weimar Germany happens, except Weimar Germany was on a gold standard. Oops.
Right.
So that doesn't work either.
Let's keep going.
To confront issues as a team. And I wanted to point out, I think the last time we heard about taxes was when Bush was running for re-election, and earlier he had said no new taxes. Read my lips.
Wow, George Bush the first, you mean?
Yeah. And didn't the whole world understand, certainly the part that supports political action? Don't ever raise taxes. Just print the money.
Yes.
Just print the money.
Yes. And raising taxes is political death.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you're right. Maybe it's $2.5–3 trillion a year they get in taxes, and they're spending, like Biden's budget was around $6 trillion. So they're obviously printing a lot more money than they take in. Why can't they just come and say, here's the problems, let's get together and solve it, America? There's a lot of bright minds outside of Washington that are solving problems every day. Everyone in this room solves some problems today successfully, right?
Right.
Why can't Washington do that? That's not their track record.
So they're just going to keep doing this because they don't have any other ideas, right? So this is just going to keep going on, and it's going to keep devaluing the dollar. And you're saying that we're at the end of that cycle, right? So the dollar was worth at least 50 cents.
We're always at the end of the cycle.
In 2000, is that what you said?
56 cents, yeah.
And now it's worth, according to your calculations, somewhere around 4 cents.
3 to 4 cents, yeah.
And so we can't. So at some point, this stops working.
Yeah. So modern monetary theory, from my understanding, and there's a good little write-up about it on Wikipedia.
There's a write-up about modern monetary theory on Wikipedia. I'm sure it's accurate. I want to hear what this guy's. I want to hear this guy. Here's my prediction. This guy is going to confuse
Let him talk. Relax. Let him talk.
I just want to predict.
Okay,
He's going to say
okay, predict.
MMT says we should or shouldn't do something.
Yeah.
It kind of explains that the idea is the government, that money's a commodity, and the government creates that commodity, and it can create as much of that commodity as it wants to.
Well, technically, yes, I guess.
Yeah, it's
but
like
there's a consequence to doing so.
Yeah, scientifically, I could eat half of a Snickers bar today, the other half tomorrow, and the other half the next day, and on and on. And I would, until the atomic level, I'm still eating a Snickers bar. But it doesn't satisfy my hunger.
Right. Okay.
So it's valueless, but it still exists. So, I mean, evidenced by the fact that printing money to pay bills causes things to become more expensive, causes people in America working here need to be paid a higher wage to be able to afford working. And then those jobs go overseas for cheaper labor. And we just keep digging this hole bigger and bigger and bigger for ourselves. But, well, not really for ourselves. The government's doing it to us. And it just guts the soul of the country. Like if a currency was the steel in your financial system, the metal, the girders that everything hangs off of, the stuff behind the drywall you can't see. So if the steel in your financial system is the currency, and you build this incredible shining city on a hill, as Reagan once called it, today the steel in that financial system, in the girders, is 97% weaker than when it was built. That's what makes sense to me.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear from folks.
So I guess I was wrong about what he said about MMT, but I think this is just not a useful simile. Like,
well, I mean, the extent of what he said about MMT is that MMT says the government can theoretically print money forever, which is not even just MMT saying that. I mean, that's generally, I think everyone understands that, yeah, theoretically they can do that. MMT is very elaborate on discussing what are the causes of inflation. And they do say that large deficit spending can cause inflation, especially if it goes past the capacity utilization of the economy, if the spending is being done on very specialized projects, military campaigns, things like that. I would say, yeah, I mean, MMT recognizes that it's not like they are ignorant of the fact that this can cause inflation. In fact, they always stress the point, the real constraint is the resources available in the economy, not the money, but the resources. If you don't have any more resources available, then more money printing will cause inflation. If you have the resources, it doesn't have to necessarily.
Right, which is what you said with the capacity utilization, or my previous example of the supermarket with a certain number of items in there. If the community doesn't have the money to buy all the items, giving the community more money so they can buy the rest of the items won't cause inflation until they buy up all the items and you're still adding more money.
Yeah.
Folks that think otherwise or could prove that I'm incorrect in my assumptions, I'm always willing to learn. I am not the oracle of everything. I've certainly just read a ton about it because I want to be right. I want to be able to say things that matter to folks and help them along their way.
Yeah, I think he might be open.
Okay,
What's that?
I think he might be open if somebody, talked to him about MMT in a little more detail.
Do you think Jimmy's Dore, we could send him a message on Twitter? Does he have his messages open? We should check that out after this.
I'm sure.
So, and you know what's weird is that this never comes up like at a press conference with a politician. This never comes up. There's never, like, hey, what are they doing about that $1 trillion they just printed in the last 100 days? And what are you going to do about the next trillion in the next 100 days? This never gets talked about, doesn't get talked about. I mean, I don't watch CNBC, but it certainly doesn't get talked about on any other news show.
No. To give credibility to the size of this number, right? I talked to a great guy earlier today. He was spreading fertilizer on his farm in Kansas. Said his dad's 93. I said, you're lucky to still have him around. His dad has lived 3 billion seconds.
Oh, right.
1 billion seconds is 31 years.
Right.
So if everything we pretty much do on Earth is human scale, right? Planes don't hold 1,000 people, doorways aren't 10 feet tall. Couches aren't 20 feet long. Everything's kind of at a human scale. 1 trillion seconds is 31,000 years. Now, we've been doing finances with precious metals and barter and exchange for what, 5,000 years? So they're creating 31,000 years of debt every 100 days. 34 trillion is a little over 1 million years of money. And that might sound like a preschooler's way to look at finances. But how else do we internalize?
I mean, this is just another example of saying really big number, but not having a explanation of what that big number means. But I will say this. So, okay, the amount of money has gone up over the last 5,000 years significantly. So have the number of people on this on the face of the earth and the number of things you can buy with that money, right? How much did a car cost in ancient Sumeria, Nima? How much did your cell phone cost in ancient Sumeria?
Nothing.
What was a plane ride in ancient Greece?
That didn't exist. Yeah.
Right?
How horrific it is to create $1 trillion in debt in 100 days.
So people, the metrics I've heard is that a million seconds is like 7 days or something like that, or 11 days, and then a billion seconds is 31 years.
Right.
And so $1 trillion is how long?
31,000 years. And another way to look at it is in $100 bills stacked one on top of the other. It's 690-mile high stack of money. So if I laid that stack of $1 trillion worth of $100 bills out on the highway near you and you got in your car and you're driving at 70 miles an hour, you would need to drive for 10 hours to pass $1 trillion in $100 bills, stacked bill on top of bill laid alongside the highway. 700.
Uh-oh. Don't give me a commercial. No commercials.
Miles long.
And they're doing that every 100 days.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And again, I really do think we're at the end. That's why I'm doing what I'm
Stephanie
doing.
Kelton.
And everybody can do what they want. But I'm nervous about the stock market. I took all my money out of it.
Yeah.
I did.
Oh, he's going to pay for that.
Do that. And the people I've talked to, not just.
Sorry. I think it's worth mentioning. The bigger this deficit gets, the more the stock market goes up.
Well, yeah. So the large deficits over the past years have been an absolute bonanza for the stock market. So this is exactly what I was saying. This money, the money from deficit spending, the money from investment spending, and the money from export surpluses minus household savings all ends up in corporate profit, in corporate bank accounts. This is what the mathematical. So if deficits are high, one of the greatest beneficiaries of that is the federal, is the stock market, is the corporate sector of the country, for sure.
But other people have said that's not dumb.
If they start balancing the budget, they start like running surpluses. Then that's the time.
Then run to gold.
Yeah, that's the time to be worried about your stocks. And however, not investment advice. And we talked about the permanent portfolio. That's what I do. So the permanent portfolio will automatically help you rebalance at the right time. So when stocks are very high and bonds are very cheap, for example, like in October of this past year, I sold off some stock profits and I bought treasury bonds at over 5% interest. So I locked in a very high interest rate and sold off some stock profits. Now those bonds have come up. Stocks have still gone up. Everything's fine. As long as you keep things balanced, it's all good. You don't need to panic about your stocks ever. If you have other assets in your portfolio that will do that will rise in value when your stocks fall.
Smart idea.
Okay, that's the end of it.
Yeah.
My most frustrating point is Jimmy gets it. He's had Stephanie Kelton on. He's clearly pointing out the reality of the situation, and then this guy's just totally mucking him up.
Yeah, well, it takes time for people to get this.
Yeah. Well, and he needs somebody like Dylan and Nima from Irida TV to be like, okay, let's put this in the context for you. You're on the right track. Bring that guy back on. We'll talk to him too. And if he's open, because, we used to say the same thing, right, Nima? I used to talk like that guy. You used to talk like that guy, and then we got corrected. And he said he's open to correction, so maybe we can talk to him and correct him.
For sure. Yeah, there's potential. I think that he's not a bigot, I don't think. No. But yeah, that's how the money system works. and it helps to understand that, so you make better. So you don't just sell all your stocks like Jimmy Dore just did. Now, I'm not saying that I know the future holds, but that's exactly why I don't sell all my assets or buy only one asset in order to be protected. That's exactly why you have to do a balanced portfolio, such as the permanent portfolio, for example. Or there are other ones too. There's 60-40 portfolios, which, I don't like, but there's different strategies to deal with this stuff.
We can send Jimmy Dore a message on Twitter. I'm going to send him one.
Yeah. Well, the point is, if you're upset about this trillion, yelling at the trillion doesn't do anything. It comes out of spending programs that are passed in congressional bills, and that's the place and time to expend all your energies to make it better, make sure that it's spent on better things. And yeah, I know it seems like a joke nowadays. I'm just saying that just talking about this large number doesn't do anything.
Well, and then especially talking about how large the large number is and how bad it is that it's large, because it's more large than it was large yesterday. It's just,
Well, and how many dollar bills it means when you stack them up, how long you have to drive on a freeway to pass those. There's a lot of hyperbole, a lot of metaphors that don't really deal with economics and finance.
Word. Well, I think we covered it. There were some hiccups on the technicalities on this one, but overall, we got them figured out, and it was really smooth. So, high five, Nima.
High five. Thanks to our viewers.
For watching.
Thanks, Jesus. Thanks, Andrew.
Jesus.